Go. All right. I'm going to do my best to stay within 20 minutes, so I'll try to be understandable and concise. First of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. As he said, I'm Jeff Dunn. I teach philosophy at DePaul University. And just sort of a disclaimer, this is a very new area for me. It's not really my main area, so I'll be interested in your feedback here. It's been a good learning experience for me. So here's what I want to talk about today. Consider online games that have virtual worlds, MMOGs, massively multiplayer online games. Maybe Second Life is the best kind of example here, but I think games like EVE Online, World of Warcraft might sort of meet the same description. I realize there's differences here, but I think for what I want to talk about, it's not going to matter. So consider those kind of worlds, though. The important part, they're interactive worlds, and there's more than one player. You're interacting with human players, not just it's not just a single-player game. Here's the question I want to ask. Suppose I perform an action in one of these games via my avatar that would be morally wrong if the situation in the game were real. So we're focused on a certain class of actions. Imagine that the world is real. Look at that action. Is that action morally wrong? And here's the way I want to understand this question. I don't mean, is it sort of game wrong, right? I mean, is it really wrong? Did you actually do something wrong? That's the kind of question I got interested in. And there's some logically possible answers you can give here. What I'm calling the Asymmetry Thesis is actually defended by Powers in 2003. Says such actions are never wrong. There's a real asymmetry, right, between the virtual world and the actual world. Of course, there's also the Symmetry Thesis. You could say that such actions are always wrong. I was trying to find someone who defends this. Kraft maybe defends it, maybe not. So that's why the question mark's there. And of course, there's a big middle ground, right? There's something you could call the mixed thesis. Some such actions are wrong and some aren't. I'm going to focus on the asymmetry thesis, though. And what I want to try to do is sort of two things. I want to first try to argue that the asymmetry thesis is false, so that there's not this divide between the virtual world and the real world in terms of the ethical evaluation of actions. And more than that, though, I want to tie the asymmetry thesis to something that Edward Castronova has recently, or it's 2004 recently, quasi-recently written about closed worlds. So here's what Castronova says about closed worlds. He prefers the term synthetic worlds. I'm just using the term virtual world. Here's what he says. He says, closed worlds are play spaces. Nothing matters there. Assets there have no value. Losses there are unimportant. Crimes committed create no claims of redress. Lost hours are simply lost. No act is actionable. He has this idea of these closed virtual worlds, and he distinguishes these from what he calls open virtual worlds. And I want to argue that there's a close relationship between the asymmetry thesis and these closed worlds. And I want to argue, in fact, that if you can't have the one, you can't have the other. And so even if these would be nice things to have, I don't think we can have them. That's going to be what I'm going to try to argue. So here's sort of what it's going to look like. When I initially wrote this paper, the main focus was arguments for the asymmetry thesis, the thesis that there's this asymmetry between the moral evaluation of actions. And so I've kind of come up with what I think are some of the most plausible arguments for it. I'm going to try to convince you those arguments don't work. I'm actually going to go pretty quickly through that, though, because I want to make sure I have enough time for the other stuff. Then I'm going to talk about how I think closed worlds are related to the asymmetry thesis. I'm going to argue against both of them. And at the very end, I'm going to come back and have I think the most promising response to the kind of argument I'm making has to do with this notion of consent and the consent that players give when they play certain games. So hopefully we'll have some time to talk about that. All right. So I think that the arguments for the asymmetry thesis can be sort of usefully grouped into two categories, what I'm calling it's not real and it's just a game. And these are actually the two comments that my father-in-law gave when I first told him about this. I said, do you think these actions can be wrong? And he goes, no, of course not. It's not real. It's just a game. And I think it actually sort of nicely categorizes the kinds of arguments you might try to give for this view that there's a real difference in the ethical status of the actions. So again, I'm not going to go through all these, just some of the ones that I think are the most interesting. So let's look at the first argument based on the idea that something about the actions aren't morally wrong that you do in a game because it's not real in some sense. And I should say, too, before we start, I think the easiest way to think about this is to picture a certain virtual action that you think would be wrong if it were real. So I think there's some paradigm cases here, but you can come up with your own. So the kind of cases I have in mind are sort of a case of virtual theft, say. You take someone, such that if it were real, it would be wrong, and you think that it really would be wrong. Or a case of virtual betrayal. I tell you we're going to do something, and I betray you in some kind of way. So keep such an action in mind. Here's one thing you might try to say, trying to argue that those virtual actions aren't actually wrong. So you might say the virtual actions are not wrong because they affect virtual things, not real things. So virtual theft is the taking of virtual property, not real property. Virtual betrayal is to betray a virtual person, not a real person. So it's the kind of argument I might give. I think this argument fails. I think it fails because virtual property can be property in all the ways that matter for moral wrongness. People can care about it. They can value it. There's lots of interesting economics work on how you can actually place a dollar amount on virtual property. Some of you might be familiar with. So the virtual-real distinction doesn't seem to do any work there. And I think when it comes to betrayal also, although the people you betray in an online game, they're virtual in a sense, we're talking about these interactive worlds with multiple players. Someone's avatar isn't just an object of a game. So Wolfendale, who I've cited there, writes some interesting things about how players identify with their avatars. It's their representation of themselves. So when you betray an avatar, it's not just betraying an object. There's a real person sort of standing behind it. So I think this argument fails. Consider a different sort of argument you might make. You might note that so philosophers have written some things about what's called dream immorality. That is, suppose you go to bed at night and you have a dream that you did something horrible. Did you do something wrong, right, for having this dream? And a lot of people have thought, no, you haven't done anything wrong if you dream that you did something wrong. So you might try to use this to craft an argument. You might say that virtual actions in MMOGs are not wrong because these actions are very similar to actions you take in your dream. Just as there's no dream immorality, so there's no virtual world immorality either. So here's a quote from Julia Driver, where she kind of gives this sort of argument. She says, "In the end, my view is that the dream should be viewed as another and very different context. Without systematic positive or negative effects, they have no actual moral significance. Dream immorality may have epistemic significance as a sign of something wrong with a person, but there's no dream immorality per se, and the same carries over to the other non-veridical contexts." So just very quickly, I think this argument fails too. I think it fails because the analogy is not apt. I think although there's something similar between dreams and the sort of virtual worlds I'm talking about, there are systematic positive and negative effects because there's multiple players. There's other people sort of in the world, so to speak, and that's not the same for your dream. So I think this kind of argument fails also. All right. Generalizing from two cases, I'm going to conclude that all such arguments fail. Probably too quick. So let's move to another set of arguments that I think actually are more promising. I think if you're going to try to defend the asymmetry thesis, I think it's more promising to go with the game kind of angle. So here's some things you might say. Call this the voluntary argument. You might say, look, virtual actions like theft or betrayal are not wrong because they occur within games which players voluntarily enter into. Right? Players voluntarily go into these games, and therefore the actions committed there are not wrong. So I think this argument fails also. I think it fails for a couple of reasons. But the main reason is because voluntarily entering into a space does not thereby absolve people who do things to you in that space of moral responsibility. So suppose there's a particularly dangerous area of Madrid. I don't know where that would be. And suppose I did know where it was, though, and I voluntarily walked into it. Suppose I get mugged. You might say a lot of things about me. I might have been foolish to walk in there. In fact, I probably was. But that doesn't absolve the person who mugged me. It's not like what they did wasn't wrong because I voluntarily went in there. And so I think the same thing's true of games. Simply voluntarily going into a game does not thereby change the moral status of actions committed there. But this might suggest sort of a more nuanced argument. Call this the rule argument. It goes as follows. Actions within a game are morally acceptable so long as they are in accordance with the rules of the game. Thus, if virtual theft or virtual betrayal is in accordance with the rules of an MMOG, then the virtual theft or virtual betrayal is not morally wrong. So here we have the idea that somehow the rules of the game are doing some work here. It's not just that I voluntarily enter into a world. I voluntarily enter into a world that has certain rules. And the thought is, if the rules are crafted in the right way, you can sort of change the status of the actions committed there. So I think this is I think this is a really interesting idea. I think this argument, it presents us with the idea that we have this sort of interesting power. Just as we can sort of change the laws of physics within a world, we could also change the laws of morality by just crafting the right rule system and having players playing such a game. I'm going to come back to this at the very end of the talk, this argument, because I think this is sort of the most formidable style of argument for the asymmetry thesis. But here's just a thought about why I think it might not even be successful. Suppose there's a neighborhood, a real neighborhood now, where according to the rules of the neighborhood, before you move in, everybody tells you the rules are that it's okay to steal stuff in this neighborhood. It's okay. That's the rules of our neighborhood. Why do people move in? Well, maybe their friends live there. I don't know. You can come up with a lot of reasons why people might. The thrill of living in such a world outweighs the chance of losing their property. Suppose I move in there, though, because my friends are there, and I've gotten used to the neighborhood. Nothing of mine has been stolen, and 2 years later, I come home and all of my property is stolen. Intuitions can kind of go both ways on here. My intuition is that something still wrong was done. If I didn't want my property stolen, something wrong was still done in that situation. And I think you can sort of pump for this intuition by making the action more heinous. Suppose it's a hate speech neighborhood or rape or something like that. Can these things really be sort of transformed in this way? To the extent that you think no, you think that this argument's not going to support what I'm calling the asymmetry thesis. So there's no good arguments for the asymmetry thesis. Those arguments aren't good, I don't think. So before I'm going to try to give an argument, actually, positive argument against it also. But I want to first sort of try to bind closed worlds and the asymmetry thesis together. So just to get the distinction out here, this is sort of Castronova's notion. An open world, according to Castronova, is a virtual world that's an extension of the real world. That's sort of his term. It's just like another space. It's like another continent. It's just a virtual space rather than an actual space. The norms, rules, and responsibility of the real world carry over. Contrast that with a closed world. That's a virtual world that's designed to be a place where things don't mean anything. They sort of are lacking of meaning in some kind of sense. So Castronova introduces this notion because he thinks it would actually be, he thinks that currently the MMOGs we have are open worlds, but he thinks it would be really good if we could make them closed worlds, or at least make some of them closed worlds. And he thinks there'd be all these benefits to having such worlds. And here's what he says. He says, as meaning seeps into these places, their status as play spaces will erode. As their status as play spaces erodes, the laws, expectations, and norms of contemporary Earth society will increasingly dominate the atmosphere. Living there will no longer be any different from living here, and a great opportunity to play the game of human life under different fantastical rules will have been lost. This idea that there'd be this benefit to having these worlds that are sort of cut off from meaning in a way. You could sort of do all these things that you can't really do in the real world. So I don't want to argue that it wouldn't be good if we could have these. I want to argue that, in fact, we can't have them, not in the sense that Castronova wants. But to get there, two claims about the relationship between what I'm calling the asymmetry thesis and closed worlds. First claim, I think that we have an implication here. That is, if an MMOG turned out to be a closed world, the asymmetry thesis would be true for that game. Why is that? Well, if the MMOG is a closed world, nothing means anything. So in particular, actions won't have any moral meaning. But if that's the case, then actions normally wrong wouldn't be wrong. And so the asymmetry thesis would be true of that world. So we have this implication. This means that if we can show the asymmetry thesis to be false, we can show that MMOGs can't be closed worlds. So that's an interesting implication. I think you also get something like the opposite implication, although I don't think it's quite as tight. I think if we could show that the asymmetry thesis were true for some virtual world, we would have at least gone a long way to establishing the possibility of these closed worlds. The thought is if we could somehow figure out how to make things not morally mean anything, how to make actions not morally mean anything, then it wouldn't seem to be too hard to figure out how to make things not mean anything at all and get these kind of worlds that Castronova wants. There's some other sort of technical issues about why I think that second claim is not quite as tight, but I'll leave those aside. I think maybe just intuitively you can see there's a close connection between these two ideas. Okay, so let me argue against both closed worlds and the asymmetry thesis. So I think there's a couple different ways you can argue against the asymmetry thesis. Here's an argument that I think is one of the more compelling arguments against it. And remember, the possibility of closed worlds entails the truth of the asymmetry thesis. So if we can show it's false, then we've shown that closed worlds are impossible. So here's the basic argument. It's not original with me, and several authors have sort of picked up on this general theme. Call it the argument from psychological harm. Here's the idea. Players of MMOGs identify with their avatars, and they value the things in these virtual worlds. I think I remember yesterday the fauna, what was the name of the game? Faunasphere, yeah. That sort of, yeah, this is a very good illustration of this, right? So if those avatars are not treated with respect, or if the valued things in the virtual world are taken, this causes psychological harm to real people. Since doing this is wrong, the virtual actions which do this are themselves wrong. Here's a positive reason to think that the asymmetry thesis is false. And if that's right, then there can't be closed worlds. So even if they'd be great, we can't have them. I think we can also sort of argue more directly against the possibility of closed worlds. And it's going to look similar to the argument I just gave, but here's, I think, the problem with getting such worlds. In the virtual worlds that I'm talking about, I think there's two significant features that they have, at least relevant to this talk. The players have freedom. They have significant freedom to do lots of things in these worlds. Of course, they don't have complete freedom, right? They can't do anything they want. They have to be within the physics of the game. But they have significant freedom to do things. And players value things, property, friendship, experiences in these worlds. And once you have these two things, it seems to me, you have all you need to have actions that are going to have some meaning to people. Things just are going to matter to people, and there's not really much you can do with it. Here's some ways you could make the actions people commit not matter in some sense. You could take away their freedom so that they're not actually doing anything. They're not actually acting. They're just sort of following one track. But of course, then it's not a virtual world. Then it's like a virtual painting, right? You're just sort of being navigated through it. Or we could make people not value things in those worlds. Right? We could make it so people don't value those things. Then maybe the actions wouldn't be wrong. But in that case, they're not going to have any of the benefits that Castronova thinks that we get, right? If people don't care, if the only way we can make them closed is by making people not care about them, then we don't get any of the benefits of such closed worlds. Okay. So Castronova does say some things about how he thinks we could have these closed worlds. In fact, he says it's fairly easy to create conditions under which games do or do not matter. It's a choice we make as a society. And he gives some examples. These are his examples. So he says, for instance, if we allowed football players recourse to the legal system for in-game actions, so a particularly hard tackle and you can sue somebody, that would make games matter more, right? I think that's right. I think it would. We'd care about them more. Certainly the players would care about them. He also says we could delocalize sports teams, right? You could sort of, how you'd actually do this would be tricky, but that is, you don't tie a team to a particular region, and you sort of make people care less about the games. So what do I say in response to these kind of examples? Well, the obvious point is that this shows us that we can make them matter more or less, not at all or to no extent. But I think there's an even a more fundamental problem with these kind of examples, and that is we need to be clear about whether or not these things make people care more about what happens in games, or whether or not it really makes things matter that happens in games. So we can care about what happens, or the things in the games could really matter. Now, you might think that whether or not something really matters is just a function of whether or not people care about it. It's a plausible sort of thought to have. If that's the case, though, then the only way you can make these games not matter is by making people not care about them. And then, of course, we're back to the same problem. They don't have any of the benefits we thought they had, these closed worlds. On the other hand, maybe you think that things can matter independently of whether or not people care about them. But if that's the case, then these examples just don't do anything to tell us. They don't do anything to support the claim that we can really make actions in games matter more or less. They just show us how we can make people care about them more or less. So I think these kind of examples, I don't think they show us that we can get these closed worlds. How am I doing on time? Okay, so I'll go really quickly here. Last sort of thing, and this is something I'm still thinking about. Well, I'm thinking about a lot of it still, but this in particular. you might think that there's, so I'm arguing against closed worlds, but you might think that there's something of a puzzle here. So think about playing a game that's not a virtual world game. Think about playing Risk, something like that. Suppose I invade your country when we're playing Risk. I don't think I've done anything wrong, not even a little bit. I don't have any sort of sense that I've done something morally wrong there. So you might think, well, just take how do we do that in Risk, right? Or boxing. How is it okay to hit someone in the face? What do we do there? Just do that sort of wholesale in these virtual worlds, and we could sort of establish some closed worlds in some kind of way. And I think if you think about these kind of examples, I think, at least what I was led to, is the idea that the way we do this in Risk and boxing is by some notion of consent. Somehow it's consent that has the power to transform actions normally wrong into actions that are no longer wrong. And so you might sort of try to give the following proposal. Virtual actions are not wrong if they are two things now, in accordance with the rules of the game, and the players have consented to play by those rules. So you might say maybe that's what we get from thinking about these cases of boxing and Risk and whatnot. So if we craft the right kinds of rules and get the right kind of consent, then we could have virtual worlds that really would be closed. That's the proposal. And so just quickly in closing, I think this is an interesting idea. I'd like to suggest several challenges this kind of idea has, though. First, a lot of writers have thought there's a limit to consent. That is that consent can do some things, but it can't do everything. So you can consent to a lot of things and make a lot of actions normally wrong, not wrong by consenting to them, but it can't make any action that normally would be wrong, not wrong. There's some examples of this. I'll just skip over. Second, I think, and this is a particular game issue with respect to these virtual worlds, it seems to me with these virtual worlds there's a real ambiguity about what the rules are. And given that, it's hard to know how you could consent to the rules. Now, you might think this is a practical problem. We could just write out the rules for some online game. But if there are really these virtual worlds that have this significant freedom, it's not clear that we actually could write up a comprehensive list of rules for this game. And then there's a in principle problem with consenting to the rules of these virtual worlds. The third kind of challenge, I think, the kind of consent we get in games might have the wrong scope. So what do I mean by that? So contrast the case where I consent before I play a certain online virtual world game. I consent at the very beginning that anything that happens in there is okay, and then I go and play the game. Versus the case where in the game, someone comes up to me and says, can I steal your property? And I say, sure, go ahead. Different kind of scope, right, for the consent. And a lot of writers on consent have thought that this sort of wide scope consent doesn't really work. It's only particular specific consent that works, and so the kind of consent we get in games wouldn't actually be sufficient. And finally, wrapping up, and this touches on sort of the value of these closed worlds. I think consent, it changes actions, not just their moral status, it actually changes sort of the nature of those actions in ways that maybe impoverish these virtual worlds. So, right, if you want to go to a world where you can steal things, it's not normally because you want people to be okay with you stealing things, right? Somehow you didn't get the experience of stealing something if it's all consented to in this way. And if that's right, then maybe even if consent can give us these closed worlds, they're going to be impoverished again in the way that makes them not as valuable as we might have thought. So wrapping up quickly, the asymmetry thesis is true of a virtual world if the virtual counterparts of wrong actions are not wrong there, and closed worlds are worlds devoid of meaning. I think these are closely tied together. I think that it would be really cool if we could have them, but I don't think we can. Thanks.
Well, I see there's already hands coming up immediately. There's one at the back there. We'll take that immediately. Ethics is always interesting because it always gets people going, you know.
Thank you for an interesting speak. Two things. One might be, it could be interesting for you to look at two board games or card games. One is called Intrigue. It's known for being evil. And the other one is called So Long Sucker, or something worse, depending on which version. John Nash did it. Both those games force you to go into agreement with other players and then break them. the dynamics of the game forces it. So that could be a twist on it. They're not massively multiplayer online games, but
Intrigue was the first one, and the second one was called
So Long Sucker.
So Long Sucker. Okay.
Yeah. And then what's more of a question, it seems like there's not that much of a problem with killing people. We don't see that as much as a problem. Is that an indication that we can have these closed worlds, or what's that all about?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. So notice, I mean, maybe this makes the talk less interesting. I don't think the symmetry thesis is true. I don't think anything that would be wrong in a virtual world is wrong in the real world. And you might think that, in fact, the way that killing works in most of these games is actually makes it a sort of a poor analog of really killing someone. So the player comes back normally, right? It's not gone forever. I think if they were gone forever, they can never rejoin the game. We might have very different attitudes about whether or not it's acceptable. So yeah, maybe that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah, but theft is also a bit of a scale there also.
That's right. No, that's right. That's right.
Okay, others? Okay, John Richard.
I'm wondering whether you might be missing one important asymmetry argument. I think that the problem is very interesting. If you have an action A, can it be, and you wonder whether it is morally wrong, and then this action is a virtual A, and then all you can deduce is probably that it is virtually wrong, right. And that doesn't help very much, right?
Right. Yeah.
But one very simple asymmetry argument is that action A is pretends A. It seems to me that would, I don't adhere to that position myself, but it seems to me that would give some clarity to the moral evaluability of an action. Because it would explain, right, if you pretend to do make-believe, that you do a killing or a shooting, etc., it would explain that you are very attached to it, but it would also follow that might not be morally significant. And there will also be slight moral distinctions to make. A lot of things that you make believe to be the case will be really not wrong, but somehow there's certain things that you can make believe that you ought not make believe. So you would have a sort of weak sort of moral evaluability.
Right.
So I'm just that's yeah.
Let me just make sure I'm understanding. So is the idea that that there's something similar between the actions you do in one of these games and the kinds of like pretense actions you might do, let's say when you're in a play or something like that, or you know.
Yes, when you shoot someone in Doom, you are not shooting someone, you are believing that you shoot someone.
Right.
So then the question is it wrong to make believe that you shoot someone?
Right. And so I guess one thing I was sort of struck by is that it seems that maybe this is just a contingent fact about humans. We don't seem to actually be able to do that very well in these virtual worlds. The make-believe very quickly becomes, it's not, of course it's still make-believe, people don't really think they're in these worlds, but they start really caring, and once they start really caring, it's hard to have this happen.
Right, but then again, if it is make-believe, then it explains phenomenologically that you are very attached to the things you do, but it would be legitimate to say that you ought not be that attached.
Oh, right, yeah. So yeah, in fact, some authors do say this, right? That, well, you should tell these people who play these games not to get so involved in them, right? That's a mistake at the beginning, and you know, then we have these.
Then again, I do think that asymmetry argument is wrong because there's clearly a distinction between. I mean, you can have real friendship, for example, and you can really insult someone, etc., and that would not be make-believe.
Right.
Okay, I think maybe we can stop at that point. Thanks very much, Jeff. That was very interesting, stimulating.